knows the ground situation very well. This is obviously now a wicked problem, and a wicked problem by definition is extremely complex and not very easy to deal with. So just walk us through this.
So the war in Syria has been going on now for, this is the 8th year. There's more than 500,000 people dead. There's more than 500,000 people. There's untold numbers of people who have been injured and displaced from their homes. There's 6 million people displaced inside the country and another several million displaced outside of the country, totaling 11 million people who have been forced out of their homes to places that aren't familiar to them and trying to struggle to regroup their families and put their lives back together. So as your guest very clearly explained, the situation is extremely complicated. Different people have different interests, but in the end, the conflict itself grew out of a public effort to bring light to the oppression and the injustice that was going on in Syria. People were fed up with the way the government was treating people. This is a nepotistic government that has been inherited from father to son. The father, Hafez al-Assad, came to power through a military coup and then managed to create the Ba'ath Party and create the Ba'ath Party as the core of the government and the military. And it's been run through the military and through intelligence and security forces since that time, since the 60s. And Bashar al-Assad inherited that system, and he continued in the same way. He didn't change policies. He was made out to be a reformer in the years leading up to the Arab Spring in 2011 when the conflict started in Syria. But the truth is that he wasn't a reformer at all. His background of being a medically trained doctor who came from Britain, and his wife he met in Britain also, coming from a Sunni family, this kind of gave them a cosmopolitan look to the public inside Syria and the Western audience. But the fact remains that this is a dictatorial regime, and it imprisons people against their will, it tortures people to death, it kills people indiscriminately with airstrikes and bombings and gas attacks and chemical attacks and using weapons that are banned by international law. So there's a fine line to draw here when we talk about whether he's fit to rule or not fit to rule, in the sense that if Bashar al-Assad deserves to still be the president of Syria. Now the conflict is moving into a phase where people are getting tired of war, but there are groups who are basically thriving on the war. There are groups who are basically, who actually emerged in the war because of the conflict, the armed nature of the conflict, like the militias that came from different parts of the world, including Pakistan, to Syria to fight, to defend Bashar al-Assad for ideological reasons, not necessarily because of any kind of political motivation, but pure ideological motivations or even financial motivations. The recruitment of mercenaries has become something that's a commonplace in the Syrian conflict. People are being paid to come and fight in Syria to defend Bashar al-Assad. Now that the Russians and the Iranians have spent the last 3 years to shore up the regime's defenses, in the sense that they've given the regime manpower, they've given the regime money, they've given the regime heavy equipment, they've given the regime even air cover. The Russians have provided the regime's air support for the past 3 years of the conflict without fail. They've even attacked other international countries, or basically defended against attacks from international countries on behalf of the Syrian government. So now you have the Russians, by proxy defending the Syrian airspace, and the Iranians by proxy defending the Syrian ground. And there's a very convoluted situation developing in terms of finding a political solution. Recently, the groups, they went to Astana. Russia, Iran, and Turkey have started this process, and they've made some success in terms of establishing a demilitarized zone in Idlib. Before that, they established 4 de-conflicted zones, de-escalation zones is what they called them. But eventually, we saw that the regime in the 3 de-escalation zones that don't exist anymore, the regime was able to continue its airstrikes using the pretext of attacking terrorists who they didn't agree with whether they were terrorists or not with the other parties involved in the Astana agreement. So they cleared out Homs, they cleared out Daraa, they cleared out Ghouta of Damascus. All of the opposition fighters, whether we agree on who is a terrorist or not, was forced out of there.
But that's a very important distinction, Ubaida. You would agree with me, because as I said, the situation now is very complex. On this note, I must also introduce my other guest here, Satare Siddiqui, who's a political analyst from Iran, has also joined us. But Ubaida, here's the thing. Of course, there are state and non-state parties that are supporting Bashar al-Assad, But equally, there are state parties that are supporting the groups that are operating against Bashar al-Assad. So this is something which, and you also talked about the fact that some of the groups have emerged because of the conflict. And now, of course, there is a conflict economy that exists in Syria. Now, given this, I want to ask you an interesting question about if you were to go back to 2011 in the wake of the Arab Spring and when the political opposition began asking for more rights in Syria. With this hindsight, if you were to go back, would you think that it was a good idea to take up arms against Bashar al-Assad, or would the political opposition have taken a different route?
Syrian opposition and people who were involved in the Syrian revolution and conflict since the beginning are asking themselves this. The answer to that question is probably not going to get us anywhere. Even if we said, and if we wanted to say that the decision to take up arms against Bashar al-Assad was a bad strategy in order to create some kind of political change in Syria, it's something that's behind us, done and dusted, because now we have countries like Iran, these are not non-state actors, like Russia, like America, like Turkey, that are on the ground inside Syria. The actual geography of Syria has changed due to the presence of these countries inside Syria. Could the Syrian opposition have stopped this in 2011 if they decided not to take up arms? I don't think so, because I believe that this is some kind of, there are, as our guest previously, the former minister mentioned, there are parties involved with specific interests and who had very big plans in terms of the geopolitical makeup of the region and wanted to achieve specific things. And the situation is still developing, so we're not reaching the end of it yet.
Okay, I'm going to come to that because she talked about realpolitik, and that's a very important issue here. But let me pull in Satare Siddiqui. Welcome to the program, Ms. Siddiqui. You were hearing Ada Hittu talk about the situation in Syria and the Iranian role, the oppression that was unleashed by Bashar al-Assad. Give us a perspective on the Iranian position as far as this issue is concerned.
Thank you for having me on the show. I would like to start with replying to your other guest's comments on the involvement of Iran versus Turkey and other countries in the Syrian conflict. And you pose a very good question. Would it be a good idea to support those terrorist groups who oppose the government of Bashar al-Assad if we go back to 2011? I think the answer is very clear. If you take the humanitarian crisis that has emerged in Syria, of course it would be the worst option always to take up arms to oppose a government which has been elected by the people and which has a representative in the United Nations. I may not or may be in favor of the government, but it does not concern me if, the people of Syria have to decide. No one had the right to get involved in Syria.
But Ms. Siddiqui, the issue here is that the system in Syria was not configured in a way which would genuinely get the expression of the people of Syria, and the entire thing started because the people of Syria wanted Bashar al-Assad to go and to open up the system.
Yes, I understand that there were opposition groups, there were civilians, there were a Syrian population who were against Bashar al-Assad. But when a government has a system accepted by the United Nations, if you want to help the opposition groups, you have to be very careful who you are funding, who you are supporting. If it's some unarmed opposition groups, okay, then go for it and support them. But when you know that they are Al-Qaeda affiliates, they are terrorist groups who have shed the blood of Syrian people, you're not helping the nation. You are actually helping those who are looking for political benefits out of this crisis. And that's my point. I do not, who am I to say that I support or I do not support the government of Bashar al-Assad? It's upon Syrian people to decide. But if Iran and Russia are in Syria, it has been upon the formal invitation of the government in that country, which has a representative in the United Nations. But what about Turkey? What about United States? And I have to add also that Turkey is a part of NATO, and of course they are looking for fulfilling the interest of the larger group that they are representing. And just as we were talking today, there were attacks by the U.S.-led coalition in some parts of Syria. And who are the people who are being attacked by those coalition? They are the Syrian people.
Okay, so where we started, let me just fill you in on that, about the Constitutional Committee talks in Astana that failed between Turkey, Iran, and Russia. Now, give us a sense of what the Iranian position on that is, because obviously this is part of a peace process or a peace initiative, which is also being supported by the United Nations. So what is the problem there now as far as the Constitutional Committee is concerned?
I think just as the Russian and the Syrian representatives have been stating after the conference, Turkey is not really helping the initiatives for the peace talks go smooth. Turkey is still supporting some opposition groups which are not moderate, and you know that when the Astana talks started, Turkey, during the process, Turkey was also invited to help the peace process by working as an intermediary between the opposition groups and the Syrian government. And the Syrian government allowed for that, but made an exclusion, made an exception, which was the non-moderate opposition groups. So the problem now is that, as you know, there are opposition group, moderate opposition groups involved in the Syrian peace talks as going in Astana. But there are other opposition groups which are not moderate and which have been affiliated with Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, the problem is that it's very difficult because several state actors are unfortunately sponsoring several other non-state actors. But let me get a quick word from Ubaida on this, because I have also to wrap up. Ubaida, you want to put in your word on this Constitutional Committee issue?
But my issue with the Astana process and the way I see it is that this process is basically hinged on to UN Resolution 2254. Whether it's Iran or Russia or Turkey as a guarantor in Astana, the entire process is dependent on it meeting the standards and meeting the requirements of UN 2254. UN 2254 puts out a clear plan on transitioning away from Bashar al-Assad at the head of the government, transitioning away from the war through the formation of a constitutional committee made up of people from both the government and the opposition, and the multiple other parties that have a political interest inside Syria, and also a transition through an open and free election that's observed and verified by the international community. Bashar al-Assad, Iran, and Russia, they're not interested in sitting down at the table with the opposition and going through this process. any way that Russia and Iran, in my opinion, can keep this process out of the UN Resolution 2254 basket, this will be a good thing for them, because they can delay any kind of international binding decision that would force them to leave Syria, because the Syrian government and Iran continue to say that Iran was asked formally by the Syrian government in Damascus to come on its behest. And the Russians argue the same thing. So they don't feel like they need to leave. They don't feel like they're a foreign occupying force, that they refer to some other forces inside Syria that are international in nature. So there's a kind of there's a way a misrepresentation about the roles of the international actors in Syria and in the Astana and the UN process.
I think that's all the time I have. This clearly, Satare Siddiqui and Ubaida Hittu have different perspectives on the situation, which of course is legitimate because the situation is wicked. But thank you to Satare Siddiqui and Ubaida Hittu for being part of the program. And